Well, good morning, everybody. As we wait for folks to get into the screen here from the waiting room, just want to say welcome. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to have Christian Brose with us this morning to talk about Kill Chain, Defending America in the Future of High-Tech Warfare. And we want to thank you all for being part of the discussion. Just to start with an administrative note, Chris will be taking Q&A from the audience. And if you want to ask a question, you can either on the participants tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you can click on participants and then raise your hand. And then Dan will call on you when we get to that time of the discussion. You can also use the Q&A tab to enter a written question if you prefer to just write it in. And then Dan will offer an opportunity for folks that may be calling in on the phone to ask questions as well. But we're looking forward to, Chris has offered to save a good amount of time for Q&A, so I know that our audience is going to have a lot of questions for him, so that should be a great conversation. But let me just say welcome, Christian Brose. Thank you for joining us to talk about Kill Chain and your learnings from quite a significant career in making U.S. defense policy and resourcing the U.S. military for its missions. You come to us after having spent many years as staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee and shepherding a number of defense authorization bills through the Congress, having been a senior advisor to Senator John McCain. And I'm sure a lot of his wisdom and lessons will shine through in the book. But we appreciate you coming to spend some time with us today to talk about your learnings. You being here is really interesting for us for a number of reasons. The Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, together with the Mike Rogers Center for Intelligence and Global Affairs, has been very focused over the last several years on some particular areas of national security policy. More recently, we started to group our thinking under this umbrella of a new great powers competition, which is very relevant to, I think, the approach you take in your book. To drill down specifically, we've been looking in the last couple of years at the space domain and how the U.S. can try to maintain preponderance in space. Of course, part of that has been trying to create a better interface between the federal agencies and the innovative private American space sector, which is actually quite exciting and growing quite quickly. You will be unsurprised to know that some of the dominating thoughts in that space surround procurement questions. How does the agency interface with the private sector better, more efficiently? But also thinking about resilience to the systems. Are we buying the right things? Are we creating constellations of satellites that can survive and that are actually performing the functions that would really get us where we need to be in terms of national security? We talk about the Space Force bureaucracy in the hopes that we don't focus too much on the bureaucratic parts, but more on the mission part. Are we building to achieve an outcome that makes sense? We've also been looking very specifically at advanced technologies and competition with China over 5G communications, artificial intelligence and quantum systems. Of course, cybersecurity permeates all these discussions. But one of the things that remains a large question mark is, are we thinking holistically enough? Are we looking at how all these things come together in a way that would impact a really fruitful American national security strategy? And are we building and preparing for the future that we know is coming? So that's why we're very happy to have you, Chris, to talk about Kill Chain. What I'd like to do is just offer you some opening time to talk about the book, your thinking, some of the key findings, and then we'll go to audience Q&A after that. So let me turn it over to you, Christian Brose. Thanks for being with us.
No, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you. I appreciate it. I think the work that you guys are doing is outstanding, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to spend some time with you. I'll take a few minutes just to kind of go through, I think the major points in the book, and hopefully that'll really kind of lead to a good discussion and interaction with the folks listening and calling in. I'm asked a lot why I wrote this book, and it's a question that I've asked myself. I asked myself every single day while I was writing it. Why on earth did I do this to myself? Ultimately, what I wanted to do, I spent a lot of time in government. As you mentioned, 10 years, 9 years on the Senate Armed Services Committee, some time at the State Department before that. I've been thinking about the intersection of national security and emerging technology for a long time. And really wanted to sort of think through what I think the implications are going to be and try to make sense of it for myself, but also for an informed general audience. A lot of these conversations about technologies such as artificial intelligence and new space technologies, things that we're talking about, as well as kind of the military concepts and capabilities, they can become very technical very quickly. They can become the domain of experts and specialists and sort of folks inside the Beltway or in Silicon Valley very quickly. What I wanted to try to do was unpack this a bit for people who are paying attention, but who are not necessarily as steeped in the technical details, as some of the people who are really doing this work. And I think really thinking through where are we going? We talk about the impact of artificial intelligence on national security. What is that really going to mean for the United States military? Those are the kinds of things that I wanted to kind of think through in the course of writing this book and presenting it. And ultimately, I kind of bring it back to the question of what's the problem that I think we face. And, I can put it pretty plainly and pretty starkly, which is I think that the United States military, and to some extent, the Department of Defense more broadly, has been building military capabilities and planning to operate them for decades now, based on assumptions that are increasingly being overtaken by events. They're being called into question by the development and sort of pace of these technologies themselves. And then they're being called into question and undermined by the emerging challenges and threats that we see from great power competitors and really primarily China. And to focus on that, where I start the book is, with a bit of an anecdote from an experience that I had with Senator McCain, where for a long time we've been trying to sort of focus the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Senate more broadly, the Congress more broadly, on the sort of accelerating erosion of America's military technological dominance, and the sort of emerging challenge and threat that we saw in China's military modernization. And we did a lot of briefings, we did a lot of hearings, and on this one occasion, kind of brought people in to really talk to the committee and talk to the whole Senate about what does that threat really look like? And it led to a conversation that I had with the senator, where we actually sort of sat through and thought through, how would this actually go if God forbid we ended up in a conflict with China, putting aside the circumstances that might bring that to happening. How would it actually unfold? And I think the things that really concern us is that when you look at how China has modernized its military for 30 years, really going back to the aftermath of the first Gulf War and the lessons that they took from that, they have systematically and methodically built up military capabilities, advanced military capabilities, to call into question the ways and means with which America projects military power. So they have looked at how the United States fights. They have gone to school on us, and they have responded very methodically. This was not like a hurricane that hit us one day by surprise. If you look at the systems they've been fielding, they started by going after U.S. forward bases and military installations in the Asia Pacific region from which we would project power in the event of a conflict, targeting those bases with long range and intermediate range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, large quantities of fires. They've recognized the importance of strike aircraft in the sort of American way of war, and built dense and longer range networks of integrated air and missile defense systems. They have gone after ways and means of targeting the carrier and the carrier battle group, America's sea bases from which we would project power from the sea through over the horizon radars and long range reconnaissance satellites, targeting aircraft, anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, again, trying to overwhelm these platforms and bases with large quantities of weapons. And then more recently, really building out the capabilities to make real what they call in their doctrine systems destruction warfare, which is essentially, how they would try to rip apart America's battle networks and how we command and control our forces. Everything from denying and degrading the movement of information, communications between military systems, the command and control and operating centers through which we, kind of process information and move out commands to the force, our satellite, constellations on which we rely so heavily for information and intelligence, position, navigation, and timing. And ultimately then the sort of the logistics of how we'd even move a force into a position to be relevant. And I want to stress that I don't think that China is 10 feet tall, and I don't think that the United States has no means of responding. But I do think that they've made a lot more progress than most Americans realize. And I think we've been much slower at responding, as a nation than most Americans realize. And I think we've gotten ourselves into a position where China has not been trying to play the same game that we are playing. They are very much trying to disrupt the way that we operate our forces and field military systems. They're playing a different game, and I think increasingly that's putting the United States in the position of really playing a losing game, where if we keep doubling down on the ways we've done things, I don't think that's going to end well for us. And to sort of summarize the problem, the assumptions that we've made about how we would operate the U.S. military are increasingly built around kind of small numbers of very large, very expensive, very heavily manned, hard to maintain military systems, very costly military systems, platforms, whether it's carriers, bases, vehicles, aircraft, things that are very few in number, very hard to replace. And China has been building up advanced military capabilities to identify where those systems are and try to overwhelm them with larger numbers of less expensive systems. This, like I said, didn't just happen. I think Americans are right to ask, how did we find ourselves in this position? And I try to wrestle with that a bit in the book. And the kind of the short put in it I would make today is, to a large extent, look, we've been very busy as a nation over the past 20 decades. We had 9/11, we had the response, the wars, the counterterrorism operations that we had to do to meet, real, present, and clear and present dangers to the United States. But at the same time that we were fighting those wars, fighting those terrorist networks, we as a nation were spending hundreds of billions of dollars trying to modernize the United States military, and oftentimes, modernizing the wrong ways, doubling down on the ways and the systems that we had used for a very long period of time, trying to make them incrementally better, or worse, trying to, use unproven technologies to quote unquote transform these military systems, but again in a way that is very conventional, very traditional, kind of incrementally better and better improvements on systems that we've in many cases relied on for decades. I think the underlying problem that I speak to in the book are the incentives that we have created in what my old boss, Senator McCain, used to refer to as the military industrial congressional complex, modifying President Eisenhower. And, I don't say that pejoratively. I mean, I think this is the nature of our system and we're not going to change it. It's how it's always been. We have a democratic system, and our military is built not in a free market context, but in an inherently political environment where the decisions that the president makes, the decisions that the Congress makes, the influence that industry has, I mean, that is how these decisions get made. And the problem has been that over many years, we've created incentives that have reduced our defense industrial base, consolidated it, made it more closed, made it harder for new entrants who are developing new technologies to not only get in and begin doing national security and national defense work, but to really transition that work into larger scale military programs of record, real leap ahead capabilities. And unfortunately, this has been playing out where, one of the most significant technological revolutions in modern times has been unfolding. And it's been unfolding largely in the commercial sector, driven by, in many cases, commercial companies who really have little knowledge of national security, and in many cases have little interest and willingness to do work with the US government. And, for some, that's an ideological choice. But for many others, it is a business choice. And it's, again, back to that question of incentives where, the decisions that have been made by the Congress, by the executive branch over many years, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, have made it very difficult for new entrants to get in, very difficult for them to operate on timelines that are more rapid, more responsive, better capable of getting systems into the hands of operators and fielding them quickly at scale. And the sum total of this has been a consolidation in the defense sector, and a situation where many of the kind of commercial technologies, many of these kind of emerging technologies, from machine learning to machine autonomy, things that are happening in the commercial space sector, like you've mentioned, on and on, many of which are technologies that men and women in our military rely upon every day in their private lives, are nonetheless not available to them when they do their jobs, and they have to rely on older technologies, very manual processes, and many times, in many cases, they're working in very similar ways to the ways that their parents were working when they did these jobs many decades ago, highly manual, all too slow. And that's where we've been disrupted. So it's sort of a simultaneous disruption of technology on the one hand, the march of technology, and the emergence of great power competitors, and primarily in the form of China and its military modernization. The thing that I should stress in this book is that when we talk about national security strategy, sort of meeting the challenge posed by China, looking at what these technologies will allow us to do from the standpoint of national security, there's a lot beyond the military domain. Obviously, that's going to have to go into this, that we're going to have to get right from the standpoint of diplomacy, intelligence, our economic statecraft, the role that our values play in these competitions. That is something that I recognize in many cases are going to be even more important than the military tools that I'm speaking about, the sort of military domain that I'm writing about. But this is something that is kind of outside the scope of what I write about, but certainly critically important. So when I ask the question, sort of, what do we do about this? The question really comes down to getting a handful of things right for a transition that we're going to have to make from the military we have to the military we need. First of all, I think we need to recognize the opportunity that we have with these technologies. There's a lot, I think, that people are wrestling with of, what is artificial intelligence going to mean for the future of military power and military competition? For me, the reason I titled the book The Kill Chain, the reason I sort of fall back on that as a theme or a metaphor throughout the book, is the thing we are actually trying to do. The kill chain is a term that most people in and around the United States military are very familiar with, but very few people outside of that defense world have ever heard of. And at its most basic level, it is a process of understanding what is happening in a military competition or on a battlefield. It is deciding what you want to do. Once you gain understanding about what's happening, it's making decisions about what you want to do. And then ultimately, it's the actions that you take, and the ability to act to create effects, whether those are lethal effects or non-lethal effects. That is the process that the United States military goes through. And that is the thing that we are ultimately building military capabilities to achieve. It's not that we are trying to acquire military platforms or have, a 355 ship Navy for its own sake, or a 386 squadron Air Force for its own sake. We are trying to accelerate the process of understanding, deciding, and acting, being able to do it at larger scales and faster speeds, more dynamically, more flexibly, creating decision advantage and information advantage for the United States military vis-a-vis our competitors. And the question of what are the capabilities that we bring to bear to do that is really the thing that we're going to need to sort out. But we have to look at the problem in its own terms. And I think that's where you start to see the value that these technologies will present. Artificial intelligence, space technologies, biotechnology. Ultimately, these are enabling technologies that will add value across that entire process of the kill chain. It'll improve the quality and quantity of understanding. It'll enable us to process larger quantities of data, mine that data for the objects of interest, the pieces of intelligence that human beings are looking for, so they don't have to do it manually, so they don't have to essentially drop 95% of that information on the cutting room floor because they just can't get to it. Taking advantage of information to make better decisions. When it comes to decision making, again, accelerating the quality of human decision making. That's where things like artificial intelligence and machine autonomy are really going to show their value, not in replacing human decision making, not handing decision making about war and peace over to machines, but enabling human beings to do the thing that we really need them to do in the conduct of military operations, which is determine what is happening, contextualize information, have human agency over the decisions that we're making and human accountability for the actions that we're taking, but then push a lot of those more technical, more repetitive, more menial tasks increasingly down to whether it's machines, programs, software processes that will enable human beings to understand, decide, and act better. That to me is where we're really going to see the value of this from the standpoint of how we build and operate our military in these types of competitions. And I think the implications for this, when we think through how are we going to have to build that military differently, are pretty significant. So in the course of the book, I point to a pretty sweeping reimagination of U.S. defense strategy that I think we're going to have to undertake here. I think that gets to the question of the goals that we're seeking, and recognizing that in China we have an emerging peer competitor, which is far more potent, more powerful, more interwoven into the global economy, more technologically advanced than the Soviet Union ever was. And the competition is completely unlike what we faced in the Cold War for reasons we can get into, and that analogy really doesn't hold water in my opinion. From the standpoint of the constraints that will pose on us, I think we're going to have to be pretty realistic about keeping our priorities straight as far as what we're seeking to do, what we're not going to be able to do anymore, jettisoning missions for the standpoint of really enabling the United States and the United States military to focus on the higher priority problem of essentially denying military dominance to China. I think in how we operate the US military, we're no longer going to be able to assume many of the things that we've assumed for a very long period of time, that we're going to have forward sanctuaries very close to our competitors where we're going to be able to stage and operate our military. Time is not going to be on our side the way that we've traditionally assumed, where we kind of assumed that for months we would be able to build up forces in a region and then essentially initiate military operations on a time and in a place of our choosing. And that ultimately we're going to need to think about, operating the United States military in a much more defensive manner. And really, to some extent, taking a page from what our adversaries have done to us to think about building a military and operating it around how we deny a military competitor, China or otherwise, from projecting military power themselves, engaging in acts of aggression or coercion in regions that we care about, around people, places, and things that are of value and meaningful to the United States and our interests. We're going to have to think much more defensively about a strategy of denial and building U.S. military forces to achieve it. And ultimately, then that gets into the question of, what is the nature of that force that we're going to need to build? And my belief is that it's going to look very different to some extent, almost inverted from the military that we have. So rather than having, small numbers of very large, expensive, exquisite, heavily manned and hard to replace systems, we're really going to need to begin moving to a military that's built around larger and larger networks of smaller, more expendable, more attritable, more autonomous military systems. And how you operate those systems as a network to enable human understanding, decision making, and action, I think is where the United States will really find military advantage in the future. And the broader question that I'll end on is, all of this is interesting, but how do you actually make this change in a U.S. Context, a military industrial congressional complex where there are very powerful forces at work to keep the status quo, to keep business as usual. Where there are always a lot of votes in the Congress for the present, there are very rarely a lot of votes for the future because the future doesn't vote. These are the kinds of things that I think we're going to need to begin to realign the incentives in our kind of defense establishment to get the kinds of outcomes that I'm talking about. And the basic kind of point is we've got to get to a place where we're opening military programs up. We're competing them in real world experiments and events where we can discern, what is the grouping of capabilities? What is the network of capabilities, regardless of which service is building them or which company is building them, large or small, public or private, laboratories or venture-backed companies. How do I integrate these technologies and capabilities to achieve that outcome of accelerating the kill chain, improving understanding, decision-making and action, accelerating that process. That's the thing that we're going to have to continue to optimize around. We're going to have to do that in real world events where we are measuring apples to apples. We are trying to get better and better performance every year. And some portion of the defense budget is going to have to be set aside every year to really begin rapidly scaling the things that are, proving the most valuable to us right now in the time of execution. And I think ultimately that's how you begin to make this transition from the force that we have to the force that we need. I think it's how you begin to create the incentives to bring in new entrants, not just so that we can pat ourselves on the back to say, look how many startups the Defense Department is doing business with, but look how many of them are now starting to scale into larger scale military programs of record, much larger scale deployments of new technology. That's how I think you begin to attract, more American engineers and investors and companies and founders back into the defense space to do this work. There are plenty of people in this technology community of ours who are patriots, who want to do this work because they believe it's the right thing to do, who believe that the problems that we have in national defense are hard and compelling problems that, the reason they became engineers in the first place was to work on problems like that. They're motivated to try to do it. I think we in sort of the defense establishment, across the department, across Congress and industry, need to do a better job of accelerating the process from a compelling new technology, a promising prototype, to beginning to really rapidly scale things that are working and cutting away and divesting from things that are working less well. But it always has to be optimized around what the U.S. military actually is going to have to do. And that's not, again, acquiring or optimizing the things we've always had and the ways we've always used them. It's always focused on, again, how do we understand, decide, and act better and faster than our competitors, and just accelerate and improve and scale that process year over year over year. It's going to be a long transition. It's not going to be easy, but I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't think that it would be possible. It's going to be hard, but not, nobody should take away from this that I think this is a lost cause or hopeless. But I do think we need to move at it with a sense of urgency that thus far we've really not had, because I do believe we are at risk of losing our military advantage. I think that it's eroded considerably. And we need to move with a much greater sense of urgency, or else we're going to get caught and surpassed by adversaries who see the world very differently than we do. And I don't think that's a world that we're going to want to grow up in. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've put a lot of compelling ideas on the table. I'm 100% sure that folks that are on the call that have participated in our roundtables are nodding their heads in agreement with a lot of the things that you've said and that you very well laid out for us. So I appreciate that. And we've got a number of questions already lined up to come in from the audience. So I'm going to, in just a moment, I'll ask Dan Mahaffey to come in and field some of the audience Q&A. And a reminder, people can submit questions with the Q&A tab in writing, or open participants and raise your hand if you want to be called upon. But let me ask you one kind of just broad question to start. And I appreciate, having been a member of the House Armed Services Committee, I appreciate your comments about, in Senator McCain's description of the military industrial congressional complex, and your commentary on how politics plays into this. In many ways, it's easier to prepare for the war you just fought or are fighting now, because that's what American citizens know about and are thinking about, and then looking down to the future. In some ways, we also had an advantage slash disadvantage of being the world leader, in the sense that, you described China's orientation to try to figure out how to counter our strengths. That is an easier goal to define, perhaps, than the goal of being the world leader or trying to do everything. In which case, you end up with the problem of focusing too much on the getting to 355 ships and not on the why and what would you do with them when you get them. So my question for you is, can you just talk a little bit about what's the top strategic goal you think we ought to be orienting all this to accomplish? Is it countering China's rise? Is it supporting Europe? Is it promoting American values abroad? Like, what's the one top thing in your mind that we need to build towards?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think as I've thought this through, and I think, my own thinking evolved in the process of writing the book, which I think is a good thing. I personally believe that the emphasis is going to need to be much more on defense. And when I say that we've built the U.S. military for kind of offensive operations, I don't mean the sort of why of what we were trying to do. It's more the how, right? That we've built it to project power across very large distances, to sort of penetrate into an opponent's space, to kind of persist in that environment, to move and shoot and communicate with impunity. But sort of taking the fight to them is something that we have always traditionally sought to do. And I think, what's kind of become clear to me, or at least that I've come to believe in the course of really kind of looking at this, thinking about it, studying and writing on it, is that is just going to become harder and harder and harder to do when you're talking about not just a great power competitor, but a peer, specifically with respect to how these technologies are going to change many of the classic competitions of there's classic military competitions of, hiding versus finding, penetrating versus repelling, kind of having an information advantage and denying that advantage. I think the challenge with these technologies in the aggregate is it's going to be really hard to hide. It's going to be really hard to penetrate. You're going to have larger and larger quantities of systems that you're going to have to go up against. And we've not built the U.S. military for that type of problem. So to me, to answer your question, the thing that we're going to need to get right at sort of a conceptual level is that we need to think about building and operating our military to deny great powers, be it China, Russia, other regional powers as well, denying them the ability to project power into the places that matter most to us. So it's less about us kind of going onto their turf and sort of fighting them offensively. It's more about saying, if I can have a credible deterrent, a conventional military deterrent, where leaders in China wake up every day and say, I want to keep this competition with the United States peaceful because, I don't believe that I could project military power into the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Japan, or other US allies and partners in the region, because the US military has the ability to essentially eliminate my power projection capabilities. That to me is, I think, what deterrence is going to look like, but it's a very different construct than the one that we have been, I think, operating for a very long time. And to a certain extent, it's about, playing the anti-access area denial game ourselves, and really getting to the business of how we build and operate forces for the purpose of, kind of winning by denial, rather than sort of winning by dominance.
Thank you, Dan. We got a lot of audience questions, so let me turn it over to you to start putting those to Chris. Thanks, Chris.
Very good questions here. I think the first one, I'm going to try and move through these quickly, but in the broader context of where we're at now and the idea that the COVID pandemic, the economic outcome, is going to force some kind of reduction in defense spending, if you agree with that concept. But would this hard choices that you have to make if the budget does shrink, is that going to inspire DoD to be more innovative, as we hope, or is it going to preserve the traditional platform-driven strategy?
So this is the great question in front of us, I think. It could be and should be an impetus to change. I've written a recent piece in the Wall Street Journal, where I see the implications of the current COVID crisis exactly as you said, which is defense spending had already begun to level out and turn down prior to COVID. I think the aftermath of COVID and, you know, a multi-trillion-dollar stimulus that, you know, the nation's now undertaken, to me looks kind of like a return to defense spending austerity for as far into the future as I'm willing to make predictions. The question in my mind is only sort of how steeply, how abruptly, how quickly does that defense downturn, that defense spending downturn occur? But the fact that it is going to happen, I don't think is in dispute in my mind. It can be an impetus to change. You know, the old adage that when the money runs out, it's time to start thinking. I think there are components in the United States military who would welcome the pressure to make hard choices under the cover of, you know, the pressure of Congress saying, you know, we've got to put some constraints around what we're doing. We're not going to have as much ability to spend on our military as we once did. Now, that being said, you know, I lived through, you know, the better part of my time in the Senate was under, you know, the aftermath of the Great Recession, the Budget Control Act, sequestration. To some extent, we ran this social science experiment, and, you know, we didn't really pass it. You know, there was a lot of impetus to keep doing the things that we did, to sort of deny that it was happening, to say a lot of the right things about strategic choices and hard choices and investments in new technology, but that didn't really come. Largely what we did was sort of pillage modernization for the sake of current operations. And I think we've kind of lost a lot of that decade. I don't think we can afford to do that again. I think that if we circle the wagons around the, you know, traditional legacy programs, if we don't make hard choices about force structure and prioritizing the future and future investments, we're just going to accelerate the erosion of our, you know, of our kind of military competitive disadvantage. Or the erosion of our military dominance is just going to accelerate if we try to double down on a losing strategy.
I also see a hand here raised by CSPC's senior fellow, Ethan Brown. So I'm going to turn on his microphone and let him ask his question. Yep, we hear you.
Okay,
go ahead.
Cool. Yep, thanks, Dan. And thanks, Chris, for coming on. There's a lot of really, really good information. So I'll try to make this real quick. So early on when you mentioned the failed innovation attempts with the DoD for modernization and implementing new technology. So I actually got to deal with that over the course of my Air Force career in special operations, where we were often the test bed for the new gimmicks like the Blue Force trackers and what have you. So I you struck a little bit of a nerve with me. It's a familiar pain. So that was an excellent point. My question to you is, one of the research initiatives that I've been taking up with the CSPC over the course of this year is with regards to the advanced battlefield management system that the Air Force is leading in order to implement the JADC2 methodology. So do you think that the ABMS is the answer to that technological and command and control innovation that you mentioned is needed for great power competition? And in addition to that, what do you see are the vulnerabilities for ABMS coming online? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the department is still figuring out what joint all domain command and control is going to be and how they are going to need to deliver it. I think, you know, the advanced battle management system is kind of put forward as the means by which the department will deliver joint all domain command and control. I mean, the thing to kind of just take a step back on and sort of recognize is that when we say joint all domain command and control, what we're really saying is the ability of the U.S. military services to share information with one another and command and control one another's systems and operational environments. I think most Americans would say, I thought we could do that. That's to some extent what I'm getting at in this book is, you know, I think most Americans are not aware of how, in some respects, how far behind we actually are. The kinds of things that we do every day in our commercial environment or world or with technology are still things that the U.S. military is struggling with. So, you know, JADC2, as it's called, is something that we should be able to do. We've spent a lot of money over the past 3 decades. You'd think we could do it, but we still are not able to do that. Whether the advanced battle management system is sort of what delivers that, I don't know. You know, I think they're, you know, 2 years into this. They're changing their story a fair bit. They're trying to kind of build this thing in the process, but the overarching vision is right. The overarching vision is, you know, whatever military system I'm operating, ultimately I want a battle network that is capable of collecting and processing information, sensing the environment, understanding what's happening, moving that information dynamically around, any different military system, getting information from where it is to the person or the thing that needs it as rapidly as possible so that, actions are capable faster at larger scales, at greater speeds. That's right. I don't know whether, the quote unquote ABMS program is the thing that is going to deliver that for the joint force. I think that, the jury's still out on that. I know other services are thinking about sort of what is their contribution on this going to be. I think the bigger concern that I have in my mind is just, this is one of the most technologically and bureaucratically kind of ambitious tasks the U.S. military has taken on for a long time. They're going to need to think through, where is that technology coming from? Who is integrating it? How are those systems being built and fielded? How are we, upgrading and improving them? I think that's going to take some time still to sort out. I'm not convinced we've got the story straight, but the ambition is right. The objective is right. It's a righteous cause, and I applaud them for taking it on for sure.
The next hand I see raised here is our friend Bill Bender. So General Bender, I'll connect you.
Okay, well, I'll start. Thanks for the discussion, and I want to sort of launch off of what you were just talking about with ABMS, Joint All-Domain Command and Control, and make the point around changing cultural norms and incentivization of the behaviors that you want to see. And for that, I'll use an example from my last job in uniform as a CIO of the Air Force. Literally, I'll save you all of the thrashing about and the pain, but the discussion is global command and control and a air operations center modernization effort that went on for many, many years and hundreds of millions of dollars over budget. The official Air Force position that was being called into question by Senator McCain and his staff involved, are you serious that the way ahead is just 6 more years and another $500 million in order to bring that to the field? And it took a closed room and a bunch of professional staffers and frankly an off-the-record discussion in a closed and sealed envelope to say what, as the CIO of the Air Force, I really felt about the official Air Force position, in saying that in good conscience, I could not accept delivering on 2006 requirements in 2022 to the tune of another, $1 billion, whatever it would take us to get there. And so it was canceled. And what we've seen is the proliferation of software development across the Air Force. You've heard Kessel Run and a number of other stand-ups of software factories. The point I would make is it was extraordinarily risk-taking, and it was in many ways, there was no incentive to do that other than the right thing. And certainly after the fact, little to no recognition in terms of incentivizing the Air Force for a good behavior, right? You became a loser and started to develop new modernized ways of doing this. You look at the AOC today, and it is light years ahead of where it would have been under the existing program. All software-defined everything in a modern way across a global enterprise, and yet there's been little to no incentivization around that for good decision-making and good changes of behaviors. So when I read your article, will read your book, I couldn't agree more with the premise. I've been, in uniform, recognizing the challenges in front of us for, as I like to explain at the time, we're in a defensive crouch protecting our position at the top of the hill, only everybody has a different hill. And, so that's what you're really getting at. And I just wonder any thoughts around incentivizing good behavior. Over.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And you're conjuring up all kinds of fond recollections. So I was in the Senate at the time. It was something that I worked on pretty extensively with my team at the time. And yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things in response. One, this was just something that the SASC did through oversight, right? I mean, it's a very underappreciated power. You know, getting out there, educating yourself, finding things that aren't working well that could work better, and helping the department get to a different and better answer that, you know, many people, yourself included, realized was the right answer. They just needed some help or political space to get there. That was something that, you know, we worked a lot on. The AOC example that you offered was one case where, you know, the way that I was trying to communicate it was, I want the Air Force to make the right decision. I want them to cancel the legacy effort and move to a better approach, and I want them to get the credit for it. You know, if the Congress can be the impetus to that kind of decision making, and we do more of that over time, I think that's how you start to see the patterns of behavior, changing incentives and changing culture. The second thing that I would say, you know, is the concern that I have, I think, is we're having a conversation right now, I think, in this sort of city and country around what is the right balance to strike between what the government needs to own and define, and what private industry needs to do. And the example that General Bender offered was a classic case of, you know, the wrong company trying to do a software program the wrong way. You know, there was the classic problems of vendor lock and, you know, inaccessibility, lack of openness. And I worry that the concern or the sort of knee-jerk reaction on the part of the government is, you know, the feeling and experience of having been burned by industry, you know, a different kind of industry for a very long time, that the pendulum is going to swing too far in the other direction in favor of, you know, the government is going to have to do all of these things themselves, build software factories, like you mentioned, produce their own software programs, code their own systems. I want the government to be a more informed buyer of software and a more informed, you know, customer in that respect. I want them to own the interfaces and the architectures that, you know, require vendors to be able to interoperate and play well together in the same way that, you know, I'm running an Apple computer with Microsoft applications and, you know, Google in the background. You know, we have to have those environments where the government determines the terms on which those companies play together inside of their networks and systems. But that, I think, is not to say that the government has to be responsible for building all of that software. And that's the thing that I worry, you know, is the risk that's out there. In classic American fashion, we overcorrect. And, you know, that's the overcorrection I'm a bit concerned about at the moment. But, you know, at least we're moving in the right direction. And, you know, my hope is that the kind of energy, the kinds of examples that General Bender mentioned are things that, you know, over time we aggregate into different patterns of behavior and different culture.
The next question I have, I think, that follows up to this is that idea of getting the tech talent and the startups in business with the government, but without an exit or a pathway to commercialization. Talent doesn't want to follow it, VC funding won't follow. What can be done to get a flywheel effect where dual use technologies do get recycled back into new startups to build the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think we overthink this problem pretty considerably. I mean, to me, it really comes down to, you know, in Washington, what people say is interesting. How they spend money is where you see where their real priorities are. If we're saying that artificial intelligence and autonomy and these kinds of emerging technologies are going to be central to future military advantage, we should expect and really demand, you know, kind of increasing shares of the budget going to autonomous systems and these types of technologies and capabilities. Accelerating the process from, like I was saying earlier, you know, a new entrant who has a compelling technology or capability or prototype, very quickly having processes that allow operators to determine whether this is something that is really going to accelerate their ability to work better and differently, fight better and differently, and then scale it much more considerably. Those are the kinds of incentives that I think begin to attract, you know, engineers, founders, new companies, new investors, you know, who look at the defense sector, who have looked at the defense sector for 30 years and said, you know, I'm not going to be successful working in this area. I'm not going to be able to build and scale a company or make a, you know, a good return on my investments. You know, it's not where I'm going to become, you know, kind of the best version of myself as an engineer. and they've largely fled defense and to go work in the commercial sector. I think if defense starts buying these kinds of advanced technologies faster and at greater scales and actually operationalizing them, getting them into the hands of our military operators so that they can figure out how to work and operate differently with them, you'll start to see demand increase. You'll start to see new companies that want to be founded, new investors who want to back them, out of the belief that you can actually make a successful business doing national defense work. And I think for 30 years, the reason we've had so few new entrants and companies that have succeeded is because the belief has largely been they're not going to be successful doing this. They're going to wash out eventually. They're not going to scale. And sadly, I think there's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that was true. So we're not going to change things unless we really start aligning the economic incentives in a way that puts more of our money where our mouth is about the importance of these new technologies and the centrality of them to the military that we need to build for the future.
Given that a lot of the future threats could be cyber, underwater, space, hypersonics, what do we look in terms of or need to understand in terms of our adversaries' investments in those technologies, as well as our methods of countering them, given that they are not the traditional threats we focus on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think particularly in sort of space and cyber, we need to recognize that these are domains of military competition now, and space is not a sanctuary. We're going to be needing to do things left of conflict to ensure that we have domain awareness, understanding, kind of preparation of the environment, so that we're not trying to figure that out on the fly in the event of a conflict. So too with cyber. I think the other piece of this is when you kind of look at these capabilities, what to me stands out is just sort of the accelerating speed that military competition and conflict is going to take. In the cyber domain, the information domain, certainly when you start to get into things like hypersonic flight, the decision time, that sort of kill chain process of being able to understand what's happening, what's the threat that's coming toward me, what decision do I want to take, how do I push that out to someone or something that can do something about it. The ways in which we have built the US military to address that kill chain problem are just going to be increasingly obsolete when things are moving at the speeds, when conflict is moving at the speeds that you're talking about. It's not to say, again, that we need to take human beings completely out of the decision-making process. It's more to say that we need to keep a human being where they need to be, which is having agency over the decision and accountability for the action, but then begin relying on processes that we train and trust over time to accelerate that process to the greatest extent possible, for the sake of defending, our people and our places and our allies and partners, in much the same way we've relied on sort of automated processes in missile defense for a long period of time, simply because the conflict is moving, or that operational engagement will be moving at a pace where a human being is not going to be able to respond fast enough to defend, him or herself, a ship, a base. I think increasingly that's going to be the case. It's going to be the norm. And these technologies, I think the value that they are going to bring us is the ability to keep the human in a position that they need to be with respect to operational and strategic and ethical decision-making, but really rely on these machines to help us process this vast amount of information and sort of move sort of cognitively or in this sort of decision cycle at the speeds that we're going to need to move at, to be relevant in our national defense.
And really quick, sort of a final one here, mentioning the need to reposition ourselves in the Pacific. You said perhaps a more defensive posture. We've also seen the hue and cry about the new Marine concept, perhaps moving to a lighter, more A2AD type approach. How do you think we can make those changes given the bureaucratic resistance at times?
Yeah, I put a lot of emphasis in the book on experimentation. It's something that we've, I think, largely stopped doing. I mean, one of the first casualties of the, fiscal austerity way back when was Joint Forces Command. I'm not here to say that Joint Forces Command, was the thing that had it all figured out, but at least it was a place where this type of experimentation was supposed to be done consistently at a high level, at a joint level. I think the concern that I have is that, look, we don't really know where we're going. And nor should we. I mean, it was back to General Bender's comment earlier of, if we have a requirements process that is going to try to predict what the future is going to look like in 2030 and 2035, and we're going to build technology based on what we know now for where we think we're going to want to be then, it's just inconceivable that we're going to get that right. I mean, I joke a lot of times that if that's how I had to build technology in my day-to-day life, I would have the best flip phone in America right now. I mean, we've got to be open to just the humility that technology is going to evolve, the threats are going to evolve in a way that we can't predict, 1 year, 2 years into the future with, to say nothing of 5, 10, 15. So we've got to be a little bit more humble about realizing that we're going to have to sort of experiment and feel our way through this. And that means Congress is going to have to, be a little bit more trusting of the department to, not always have a perfect 5-year plan with, spending down to the sub-program elements for every single thing that we're going to want to do and then lock us into that plan for forever. The department is going to have to recognize that it's going to have to be an iterative process year over year in sort of real world environments where, we're not doing this in modeling and sim, we're not talking about paper airplanes, but we are actually going out much the way the Marine Corps is now. And I think increasingly the Joint Force is seeking to do, to figure out how we work this stuff out in real operational environments, focused on the clear operational problems that we're going to have to solve. Not joint all domain command and control, which has kind of become a buzzword or a bumper sticker, but explain what that means to an engineer, to a military operator, as far as the problems that they're going to have to solve to make that concept real, and how we build technology, field it, and move faster. Unless we have those processes right for how we kind of experiment and feel our way rapidly to, from the force that we have to the force that we need, I think we are going to struggle to get there. But I think if we have those processes right, where we're working it out every year, we have money set aside to really scale the things that are working best in the year of execution, or to guide the fiscal decisions that we want to make for the next fiscal year. I think that's how you kind of slowly, incrementally begin turning the tanker, so to speak, in the right direction, but do it in the service of a really kind of transformational vision or goal or objective. But it's not something that we're going to carry off in 1 year. It's not something that one technology is just going to magically deliver for us. We're going to have to sort of hack this thing out year over year through real world events and experimentation, failing and learning. That's something that we haven't done a great job on. It's something that the Congress hasn't really helped the department with, and the department hasn't really helped itself with. We've got to get that right. And I think if we begin to get those processes right, the specific solutions, the answers, choices become a little bit clearer. And we're able to make them in the right context, which is, I've seen that this works. So if you want to continue to put money into the thing that we've always had, the program we've always relied upon, just be very clear that the consequences are you are going to bear the responsibility for a future catastrophe if one befalls us, because we've seen what looks like it's working and we see more clearly what doesn't. And people are going to have, I think, that sense of clarity that the stakes in this competition are incredibly high. The stakes for the decisions that we have to make are incredibly high. And we can't afford to keep doing old things or rely upon old things simply because it's comfortable. And we've got to have a context and sort of a process for how to make those decisions correctly. My hope is that we can begin to do that, but it's going to be really difficult.
Well, we have so many more great questions, but the tyranny of time requires that we be tyrants. So I turn it over to Glenn.
Chris, before we close out, and thank you very much for this session today, would you mind spending 30 seconds, just tell us a little bit about what Anduril Industries is doing. You're the head of strategy there. It seems like Anduril sits very much in that space we've been talking about today, and sort of venture, innovative, investor-driven, and fast-moving company that's making defense products. Do you mind just tell us a little bit about Anduril and what you're building?
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate it. So Anduril is 3 years old as of this week. It was founded, while I was still back in government, and had never, heard of it when it was created. Anduril was founded to do defense work, very much, kind of along the lines of what we've been talking about today. The belief that you have technologies that have been really kind of developed and accelerated in the commercial world, where the expertise in things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, distributed networking, is really resident in those companies that have been doing it, in the commercial sector. Anduril was founded to create a place where you can take that talent in those technology areas and bring them together to work on defense problems and solve defense problems. We're not a company that's seeking to build, kind of commercial technology. We are seeking to build national security products and defense products to make, the jobs that our national security professionals have to do, better, more effective, faster, safer. And we're a bit of a different breed of cat in that regard, where a lot of technology startups are focused on the commercial market and maybe could be convinced to have a little bit of a side hustle work to support the U.S. government. We are seeking to be, the next great defense company, and we want to take these emerging technologies and try to solve these problems that we're talking about here today differently, with the ways those technologies enable us, to think about the problems differently and solve them differently. So it's an exciting place to be. Things are going well. It's a struggle every single day, to work with and for the U.S. government. I knew intellectually going into this that it was going to be challenging. Now getting to live it emotionally every single day is another matter. But it's an exciting place to be and a great mission. So I appreciate you asking.
Well, Christian, thank you so much. Having been on the government side, now on the private side, we really appreciate you being with us today. And thanks for sharing thoughts on Kill Chain, Defending America and the Future of High-Tech Warfare. Christian Brose, thank you very much. And thanks to all those who participated with us. We'll see you soon. Thanks. Take care.
Thanks a lot.